Hello, 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 welcome back to my huge channel everybody, and today we're speaking about the fact that everything looks very 60s right now. And the moment this struck to me was when my friend told me that lately my chosen silhouettes of clothing on my body resembles a bit the Twiggy vibe, sometimes also going into the direction of Andy Warhol. And this is something I never actively chose. I wasn't even aware I was having a tendency to choose silhouettes from that era or anything. So before judging my friend and saying, who are you to judge me and tell me what I look like you with your North Face puffer? I know the North Face puffer is the most warmest keeping price ratio combination product in the world. In any case, I didn't feel well when I heard that, or let's better say I wanted to question if that's really the case. So I did some digging, I did some research, I did some reading here and there, and then everything made kind of sense. And you know what? Sometimes when you're too deep in this machinery called fashion, when you're too deep inside, when you think about sub-trends and subcultures and already try to predict something that is going to happen in 20 years, you forget about what is happening right now and what we're influenced by very much right now. And we're going to talk about this today. I'm going to explain to you why every single big fashion show, let's say the big ones, because the smaller brands have their other issues that I'm working on for a second video. So like every other amazing art historian would do, we're starting with some context. So first of all, we need to understand, what did the 60s do? What happened in the 60s? Why are we trying to be in this fashion cycle again? So we need to dig a bit into history class. It will not take long, but it will help us a lot to understand why certain brands and aesthetics are ruling again. So before I start to talk with you about my favorite subject, which is obviously fashion, I want to invite you into a world of happiness that exists outside somewhere as well. It's called community. There are places in the world where still kindness and happiness and smartness exists. And this place is obviously my Discord server. So if you feel a bit misunderstood, okay? If you feel like everything's fine around you, you manage your life, you have your work schedule, all these things, but you kind of miss out on fashionable conversations and deeper topics, and also want to speak with these people on live talks that we're having bi-weekly sometimes even. You have access to the Discord if you join the Patreon, where I share another, a bit more personal video every week, where I talk a bit about my personal style, what I would change. Sometimes I vlog also and take you with me on a day to somewhere else. I took you to Men's Fashion Week a bit in the last videos, and the next one that is coming is a bit of a shopping spree of mine. Feel free to join, and let's start with the video. Before we talk about why the 1960s specifically are taking over the runways, we can also rewind a tiny bit more. Imagine the 1950s. Dior's new look, tiny waists, structured skirts, and an overall very proper way of dressing, I would say. It was pretty, yes, but also a tiny bit restrictive. And nobody can convince me that you had an easy life with easy breathing capabilities while in a new look. It was not really about comfort, really. It was about a new look. And if you were comfortable in a look or not was not really what was asked for in the 50s. But that changed with the 60s. There's this big boom suddenly in the 60s that hits us all, our parents or grandparents probably, and suddenly a lot of things just change. And fashion goes from this very high class, only polished looks to a very youthful and rebellious one. You have designers like Marie Quant. She's chopping skirts shorter and shorter, which is amazing, and she's literally inventing the mini skirt. There's obviously Courrèges and Pierre Cardin that I talked about very often before, and they're making clothes that look like they belong to a sci-fi movie, and they're being used up to this date as inspirations for a lot of sci-fi movies. And Yves Saint Laurent is redefining power dressing for women, or let's probably say inventing power dressing for women. Power dressing in the 60s is definitely a different association than what we see now as power dressing, especially for women. But it's not about that. It's just a new silhouette, a new powerfulness that comes with Yves Saint Laurent as well. The fashion revolution in the 1960s was not only about mini skirts for the sake of having mini skirts and being bare-legged and just creating a new silhouette. There's way more behind it and behind all these bold patterns that we had. It was deeply connected to political and cultural shifts, happening all across the world at that time. That decade was marked by youth rebellion, feminist movements, civil rights activism, and space age optimism. And fashion kind of reflected all of these things. Probably the strongest driver overall is the youthful rebellion that starts for the first time ever. The post-war generation was rejecting the conservative values of their parents back then, and movements against the Vietnam War, racial injustice, and government control bring out a new sense of independence. What this led to was that we saw way more young people wanting their own identity separate from the older generations and be as different as possible. This kind of led to a youth quake of fashion, where also streetwear and not just high fashion became also influential. Marie Quant invented the miniskirt that just felt free, fun, and rebellious, which was new. And instead of this elegant couture vibe that was also strongly coming from the Dior and Balenciaga, there was a shift happening in this youthful rebellion, which embraced more the comfortable, affordable, and clothes that you can just easily mix and match with each other to create cute looks. Nobody wanted to be a grande dame anymore. It was about being casual and fun. So these political insecurities were kind of fueling the rise of streetwear in the 60s as well. Whereas before it was very much pushed, especially for females, to mainly run around in a very conservative and rigid way, to please everybody in the whole world with your Eurocentric beauty standard. And then there's probably also my very favorite 60s influence that we still see up to this date. The reason for that is not so amazing because it's a space race, but it led to some sci-fi influences. And the reason for that is kind of that the Cold War led to a fascination with space exploration. The US and the Soviet Union were racing to reach the moon, and by 1969 Neil Armstrong managed that. And this obsession with the future and technology kind of translated directly into fashion. So this led to Courrèges, Paco Rabanne, and Pierre Cardin kind of creating the space age fashion. So a lot of metallic fabrics, futuristic silhouettes, and plastic dresses. A lot of clothes that became very minimalist, geometric, and even a little sci-fi inspired. And the only reason for that is kind of like the future is here and this is how the future looks like and we need to dress like that. It's just an imaginated form of what one expects the future to be like, which is super fun. Like space age is hilarious. I love it. Then there was also the civil rights movement in the US, where kind of fashion was used as a tool of power as well. We saw black leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and the Black Panther Party that fought against racial injustice. And the way we saw that in fashion was that we saw a lot more Afrocentric fashion that became part of the movement. Black activists embracing natural hair, African prints, dashikis, and a lot of bold colors that were rejecting the Eurocentric beauty standards. We saw designers like Anne Lowe, who made the wedding dress of Jacky Kennedy, and there's also Zelda Wynn-Valdez that paved the way for black designers in the industry. And of course, musicians like Diana Ross, Aretha Franklin, Nina Simone, who used fashion as a form of self-expression and empowerment. Connected to all these political changes, there was something that was definitely growing as well within, which is another form of feminism, a second wave of feminism, so-called. Women in the 60s had to fight once again for equal rights, reproductive freedom. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique and women entering the workforce led to a shift in how women wanted to dress as well. So overall, when we look at the 60s, we can say that the main problems of people in the 60s that were protesting against war, capitalism, and authority. And one more aesthetic that was kind of building a net of love around all these things is the famous hippie movement. So it was the era of people embracing more handmade and DIY and secondhand clothing already back then. We had psychedelic patterns, tie-dyes, bell-bottoms. Fringe became a symbol of the counterculture of the rigid and conservative. And for the first time, fashion wasn't just about looking good anymore, it was about making a statement against an establishment as well. Knowing all these things now about the 60s, and obviously this was not the deep dive the 60s would have deserved, but I'd really tried to squeeze it in and make it as quick and compromised as possible, just for us to get a feeling again and be reminded again of what the 60s were doing. And it was wild times. It kind of looks, maybe it's just nostalgic romanticism that I have in my mind, but I always feel like it was also good times because it was the first time ever things changing. And us speaking from 2025 right now and seeing 60s influences might be cute and nostalgic and romantic, but there's actually way more sadness to it. Because a few years have passed now, but the reason we are influenced by the 60s are still the same. So that means the problems are also still the same. So I'm going to try to categorize a bit the recent fashion shows that we saw on the runway, fall 2025, maybe also a bit spring 2025. Anyway, so I want to categorize also some brands into all these different influences of the 60s. So we all are kind of aware which brands push this aesthetic still the most, and maybe also understand why they are still going for it. So I'm just gonna start with my favorite because I don't really have a structure on this channel and I'm just going to do what I prefer the most. So I will start with Space Age. And that's obviously Courrèges. I don't know why I always have to think of Courrèges as the very first name, because Pierre Cardin is actually a bit more popular, I would say. But I don't know, I love old Courrèges. And that's kind of the quintessential 60s Space Age brand, which is now revived with vinyl codes and sleek A-line dresses and futuristic minimalism. If you go now to a Courrèges store, it will be so funny and interesting to see how 60s the store looks. And very oftentimes they also look very Space Age. Usually it's just a huge wide room. There are just a few racks, there are just a few clothes. You will see a lot of patent leather. A leather form that was pretty fresh in the 60s, also reminds us a bit of this nylon and plasticky vibe that was invented and is very much Space Age and futuristic. And I really like, to be honest, the fact that Courrèges plays with their heritage. It's a very old French house, and I think it's amazing that they kind of managed to keep this 60s aesthetic, which could have looked very old school or too much or a bit forced also, but interpret it into a very modern way. And I think Nicolas De Felice does a great job here. I really like his work. I think he gets the most out of Courrèges there is while maintaining the heritage. But that's definitely a brand where you see a lot of 60s. And then there's obviously Paco Rabanne, which is a brand that I truly, truly love. Probably not the brand that I wear the most, but whenever I see runway looks, I just truly enjoy them. And that's not because there's not a correlation to Nicolas Ghesquière, because of course, if you look at the collections very closely, you might see a bit the Nicolas Ghesquière flair as well that we know from Balenciaga and his Louis Vuitton, because Julien Dossena and Nicolas Ghesquière also used to work together, so the perfect world. So Paco Rabanne is obviously known for their chainmail and metallic textures, and that's also evoking a bit the sci-fi futurism of the decade. It also has a lot of this warrior and medieval and knight and Jeanne d'Arc aesthetic that is of course clashing with the chainmail, but I think that's just a very futuristic form of bringing the medieval idea of strength and fighter as well, that is kind of translated into some Space Age aesthetics as well. The usage of the metallics themselves, the paillettes, the sequins, they have different materials they used, try to bring stuff into the look of sequins, which I think is very interesting. I think that's a very strong reference of Space Age as well, just the material to use something metallic. Then there's also, maybe a bit surprising, Dior. And Maria Grazia Chiuri has referenced, for example, the Marc Bohan's 1960s designs, including modern inspired tailoring and shift dresses. It might maybe not be visible all the time with Dior, but if you look very closely to the whole collections over the years, you'll have seen they have a bit of this minimal approach as well, and sometimes it does look a bit futuristic as well. Another energy I would say that a lot of designers like to use that is coming from the 60s as well was this new glam. It's some kind of, it's a bit more pop cultural, I think. I don't want to create a correlation to pop art, but I think the aesthetic was changing. We had the streetwear influences, but it was getting glam also. It was Studio 54. It was wild times, and I think some brands try to keep that alive. One of them is definitely, and that's kind of the only vibe I was ever getting from the brand, was Gucci with Sabato De Sarno. We just found out he's not the creative director for Gucci anymore for the next show. So the next show will be shown by the creative studio that do pretty well work, because they're a bit more team Alessandro in my opinion. So I think, I'm wishing Sabato De Sarno all the best, but I think I made a video about this 2 years ago where I said I don't see a bright future for Gucci, and I don't want to say it, but yeah, it happened. Anyway, so Gucci is one of those brands that really likes to cultivate this idea of this glam cult coming from the 60s. He likes to blend like vintage inspired tailoring and the 60s-esque accessories, which are mainly oversized sunglasses, structured handbags, plateau flat shoes, and everything looks a bit twiggy, like everything is a bit geometric in its forms, it's mini, it's cut, and it's a bit more, it's a very youthful form of showing skin, I would say. And that's kind of glammy how he combines all these things together. Then there is, of course, you can say that's also very 80s, because whenever I have to think about this brand, I need to think about the wild 80s and how I'm just semi-sad about the fact I wasn't born yet in the 80s, but it also looks fun. But there are also a lot of 60s references when it comes to Versace. And Versace is a brand that is kind of reviving the 60s glamour with bold colors and mini dresses and a lot of retro-inspired prints. The brand that does it probably the best when it comes to this I would call it still a bit of a posh glam of the 60s, and I love it, to be honest. I'm not gonna deny it. I kind of love it. It's Saint Laurent right now with Anthony Vaccarello. Anthony Vaccarello is doing a great job. He's just doing a great job right now. There are a lot of references to like very sleek and structured silhouettes of Yves Saint Laurent's 1960s designs. For example, for the Fall/Winter 2024 collection, which was all about sheerness and like sheerness only. I mean, I'm talking here chiffon, lace, these barely there layers that feel straight up ethereal. It's very feminine, it's pretty sexy, it's refined, and it's pulling directly from Yves Saint Laurent's legendary see-through gowns from the late 60s. Then there are brands that like to take a bit from the 60s but go into a different direction. It's a bit more cheerful and it's a bit more childish. I wouldn't consider it cute. It's not this cuteness that we know from other brands. I would say it's a form of sophisticated cheerfulness. And the best brand in the world for this is obviously Miuccia Prada's Miu Miu. We have a lot of youthful miniskirts and playful layering. Layering is a very important point when it comes to Miu Miu. We have a lot of retro-inspired accessories that kind of embody this carefree energy of the 60s a lot. And Miu Miu is actually a brand that uses a lot of different references coming from the 60s or that evolved first time in the 60s. And if you've been watching the Miu Miu recent collections and we're thinking like, wait, like this looks like an old editorial that I have already seen in the 90s, that's also because the 90s are referencing a lot of the 60s, but that's a different story. There's this youthquake energy that I talked about in the very beginning when I talked about the political problems that we had in the 60s, and this youthquake evolved with this whole anti-war movement and I don't want to be like my parents, and I've kind of hate my parents for what they've done in the past. So that is definitely something that is kind of in this Miu Miu aesthetic as well. So Miu Miu is deeply tied to the same rebellious spirit. Actually, it was literally created as a Prada's younger sister, more playful, more subversive brand. And just like Marie Quant and Andrew Courrèges started to design for a more youthful audience, Miuccia Prada is doing the same thing kind of just in 21st century. We have the miniskirts that came back in 2022 at Miu Miu a lot. Since then, it's unstoppable. We see the Miu Miu influenced miniskirt everywhere. And the way it's modernized today is that it's paired with modern boots and more boxy silhouettes, and there are a lot of layers and it's very undone and it looks almost like an office core styling sometimes. Then there are the big square sunglasses that were very 1960s, very Jacky Kennedy, Audrey Hepburn, Andy Warhol's factory girls. But we also have the structured wool coats that play a big part in the collections that remind us a lot of British winters, I would say, and a lot of opaque and colored tights that are a direct nod to the 60s, definitely. And in her collections, if you look at it, are like a lot of direct references coming from the Carnaby Street in the 1960s, 1966 or whatever. It's very much influenced by that, but it never looks costumey, and that's just the talent of Miuccia to create something that always has some sort of timelessness in it. It never feels like you're walking through a museum. It never feels like it's outdated. I think that's the thing that's most unique about her and that differentiates her from like every other designer I've ever seen. And if you know a bit more about Miuccia Prada, I have videos about this as well that I did like years ago, and I can also repeat myself, that's fine. I'm such a generous person, guys. I will repeat myself, no, but I'm sure you know a bit about Miuccia Prada and her past, and obviously she lived in the 60s. She was protesting as well. She was maybe not coming from the most struggling family in the 60s, but she was still on the streets fighting against capitalism. No joke comments here, please, okay? She was fighting against capitalism, and she was also fighting for feminism. And I think we see a lot of that influence, and obviously a lot of designers come from the 60s or have been born before and were influenced by that era. Like everybody that goes through any decade is obviously in some sort influenced by it. But I think in terms of Miuccia Prada, because she always had apparently also a political interest, we also see how she uses these things like mini skirts, this office looks. Her office looks are not office looks. It's not a cute office look. You are not supposed to wear that in the office. And that's the joke she creates, and I think that's her fight with the establishment. Of course, she's herself like one of the biggest establishments of Italian fashion, and I think that's how she answers to a lot of things in women's fashion that is so evolved and so strong and powerful. She just answers a lot with jokes and great references from the 60s. Another brand that does that in a bit more humoristic way, I would say, but in a very direct humoristic way, and that's why I don't find it so elevated in the execution, is Moschino. With current newish creative director Adrian Appiolaza, Appiolaza. Other brands that reference super directly because they never ever changed their patterns because they invented them in the 60s, I guess. Brands like Pucci. I think these brands are pretty wild for managing to never change. And I think never changing is something terrible. I always try to change and not even evolve, just change, you know, turn into something else and adapt. Not adapt to your environment, maybe make your environment adapt to you. I don't know, but just change is something great usually. Pucci managed to not change ever. And they just have these same fabrics and these same patterns that I kind of like. I think they're turning them a bit too much into pop culture. I feel like they need better design, but I already like a lot the patterns. But Pucci is definitely also one of those brands that they're not referencing the 60s, they just never left it, kind of. And I think if we look at Prada, and not only Miu Miu, but also Prada, especially the last collections, but also Spring 2025, was pretty clear already what kind of influences they were from the 60s. I think I don't even have to elaborate on that. Leave in the comments what specific piece of that show reminds you of what influence coming from the 60s. This is a class, guys. I didn't prepare you. I'm that teacher. I'm just telling you pens out, paper out, and you're supposed to write something. You're supposed to learn something here. It's not only about learning, actually it's just about fun, and I want to have fun, and I just like filming things and talk about random things and share them with you and start a conversation. But we can also technically learn something. If we look at the last Spring 25 collection, we see so many pieces that are strongly influenced by it. We have a lot of space age influenced things. We have the colors, the patterns. You remember the metallic skirts, you remember the hats, and you also remember the shirts. That I think is another interesting combination, because for me, the space age idea that is evolving in 2025 is a bit this AI fear, may I say, that we kind of all have. It's kind of like, yes, it's pretty beneficial, but also how long? And we filmed enough post-apocalyptic movies showing us that there's kind of not a good ending about AI. Like I don't know if there has ever been a positive thesis about the usage of AI and how it's not going to destroy us all. In any case, Spring 2025 was pretty. It was a beautiful collection. I think it was a pretty rough one, but definitely, I think this post-apocalyptic vibe is definitely coming from Ralph Simmons, of course, because the femininity we used to have, and this is something very interesting. We had a talk on the Patreon, on the Discord, but it's for Patreon subscribers, so you potentially. Because I have one business professional talk per month and we all listen to this person and interview them, and it's amazing. And last time we had Professor Vesma Contere Makian, and she's an architect, but she works very closely with the venue designers, OMA, which is from Rem Koolhaas, and they create for 26 years now the Prada venues. She has so much experience. She goes to the shows for 10 years, and she said, for example, that she's fears a bit, and it's not a fear because it's actually pretty much happening, is the loss of femininity when it comes to Prada. And that the quirkiness, the funniness that Prada always had was because she was playing with this, a bit with this femininity, youthful femininity from the 60s that was trying to fight against the establishment. And now it's turning into a bit of a rougher, a bit more minimalistic brand, a bit more serious as well, I would say, even though some people looking at the collections might say, is this a serious collection to them? Is this serious, all these accessories and shoes and stockings and socks in these shapes? Yes, it's pretty serious. It's definitely not as playful when it comes to embroideries, colors, usage of patterns, I would say also. It's getting very much into geometry, so I see a lot of space age recently actually when it comes to Prada, because a lot of stuff is like washed off. And it's a lot clearer, and it helps, I think, nowadays, because I feel like the current consumer, so you and me, I don't know if you got a bit more stupid, but I feel like right now brands try to like push into our eyes what they're creating. Like if it's Chloe, they're trying to be like exuberant Chloe, and everything needs to be very 70s and ruffles and chiffons and all these things. And I don't know, some cowboy influences or fringes and this and that. I don't know, when it's Bottega, it needs to be insane craftsmanship. Look like how my slippers are even crafted, and it's actually, if you turn it around, it's actually leather and fur mixed or something. And even when it comes to Prada, I feel like, I think it was a needed switch. I think in the end of the 2020s, it was maybe getting a bit repetitive with Prada, and I think it's super exciting right now, and it's one of my most interested in brands. But I see definitely also that here we see a core of aesthetic that Prada is supposed to stand for, which is the cool girl, the it girl that looks a bit like she's coming from a private school, but she still has some edge. Of course, brands always have an aesthetic and always a style route that they follow, and that you're also probably supposed to follow because you want to build a brand identity, and repetition helps to keep certain features in people's minds and be like, wow, this is such a diesel pant now. If you think of diesel jeans now, you probably think of one of those Glam Martin ads and these acid wash jeans and wild faux fur coats and a belt with a big D on it. So I think brand identity is amazing, but it can also be too stripped off sometimes. So I just wanted to show you a few examples of the brands that I think are kind of the most relevant maybe. I know I didn't speak about every brand, and I know there are a lot of brands out there where we can still find things. And obviously you can find other references as well. And I know there are a lot of brands that are using the 80s and 90s as well, but I think one thing for sure that makes this decade of the 60s very unique right now is also the political insecurity in our surrounding that we feel unprotected in. And that's why we are not only nostalgic in referencing these things, but I think it's not a surprise when things like human rights are being discussed again in 2025 that we feel kind of the urge again to protest against things. And I think we see that in the collections right now, referencing the 60s, but in a modern way. And the fights they have right now, and we have as millennials as well, is still the fight of having to reject certain beauty standards, for example. And gender fluid fashion is becoming a bit more mainstream. And the gender fluid fashion now is a bit like the pantsuit in the 60s. So the power dressing maybe. Then we're seeing space age designs that also could be kind of AI related because they're equally scary. And then there are also a lot of people using fashion as protest like they used to. Overall, the 1960s were one of the most politically charged in fashion history. And current designers are kind of pulling the same sort of energy. So if you enjoy making up funny stories like this or just enjoy a lot of fashion talks like this, you should definitely join my Patreon where I have another weekly video, as I said, but I'm repeating myself, which also gives you access to the most prestigious Discord server in the world, I would say, with the most amazing people. We have about bi-weekly calls. I have special guest talks. I think we are providing a lot there. And also just a lot of amazing looks. It's about personal styling as well. It's about, do my buttons fit together? Does my hair fit with my earring? You know, all these very relevant fashion questions that make the world go round. The fundament of fashion theory things. So feel free to join my Patreon if you want to be part of the quirky gang. And subscribe, of course, to this channel as well if you haven't done that yet, because you enjoyed it so much that while you were eating right now, you were like, wow, I learned something, had fun, because it's so hilarious, it's so amazing, it's so much better than pay TV, and that I want to subscribe. And you're overwhelmed, and right now you're doing it. So see you to the next one. Bye.